So, to put it very simply, I'm going to kind of start by, overall, this whole session is going to be about talking about the signs in general. If you all end up liking this presentation, we can definitely go, we could definitely go on in the following weeks talking more in depth about other things, especially like the planets and the houses and how to read a chart overall. I just kind of want to troubleshoot this, and I kind of want to like go in depth about what the signs mean and why they mean the things that they mean. So yeah, let's get into it. So the things that I think some of the biggest divisions that we use to understand the patterns of how the signs operate in the way they do is through the seasons, triplicities, and elements. Some things to know prior to that is the reason why like the signs are given the pattern that they are in terms of the seasons, triplicities, and elements is mostly because of how, especially in early agriculture, where astrology like first originated, like the connection between planting and yielding at specific times based on the climate, based on the seasons, kind of created this understanding of how just the general conditions of weather and how everything is operating or behaving at a certain time in the year kind of guides a certain narrative within each part of the sign or each part of the year. So for example, let's just get into it. We're going to get into the first division, and this will help us like understand this from the get-go. And also, by the way, while we're having this conversation, feel free to actually interrupt me and ask me any questions. I would personally prefer if you ask them vocally so that I can just answer them then and there rather than me trying to like find them in the chat. But you can do that too. I'm more than willing to answer as many as possible. I'm a little more interactive in this respect because I know like once we get into one thing and then we go into the other, it's going to be hard to get back. So yeah, definitely feel free to stop me at any time. So like I said, it starts with the seasons. That's spring. And as you can see, the seasons themselves are divided by, since there are 4 seasons and there are 12 signs, basically it's 3 signs per season. So there's, of course, Aries, Taurus, and Gemini in spring. Then there's Cancer, Leo, and Virgo in the summer. Then there's Libra, Scorpio, and Sagittarius in the fall. Then there's Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces in the winter. So some things to understand about like how those are operating, right? So why is Aries kind of the beginning of spring, right? Why is Cancer the beginning of summer? To understand the difference between the conditions of these 4 different seasons, we have to understand what's going on in them, right? So the spring deals with basically clear conditions. Like they're starting to brine up, and essentially what's happening is that because there's now clear conditions, because things are starting to finally bloom, right? We start getting into this idea of like trying to find ourselves now. Now that there's clarity, now that we can actually do things, it's now time to start planning. It's now time to start doing all these various things that we weren't able to do when things were a lot more colder and things were more scarce. Now we have the time to plant. Now we have the time to like do all the things we'd like to. When we get into the summer, it's now in a place where we've consolidated like sustained clear conditions. Not only are we've already gone through the process of like being able to figure out what it is we want to do while things are clear. Now we have a whole other 3 months to do that. And now we have the time to really take in and express who we are comfortably and find out who we are in terms of our persona rather than just who we are and what we need to do at that given time in this season. In the fall, it's more in the context of now that our clear conditions have completely vanished, we're now in a place of scarcity. And in this context, what ends up happening is now we have to lean on other people. We have to rely on cooperation, given the context of because things aren't as clear anymore, because there's less going around, because there's less abundance altogether, there is the need for partnerships, as Libra kind of initiates that. And then there's, from that, all the potential power dynamics involved in relationships. Definitely that's what Scorpio plays into, and how to learn from that moving forward into Sagittarius. By the time we get to winter, it's like the same pattern as from the spring to the summer. It's the same process of how, when there was a sustained clear conditions, in this context, it's now the sustained scarcity, or the sustained not clear conditions, where now people are relying on each other even more so than they were in the fall, because it's just continuing. In this place, now it's a focus on really trying our best to discipline ourselves through, developing structures and systems to kind of regulate our behavior, to shape our behaviors in ways so that we can make sure that the relationships we had and that we were leaning on, we're now able to use more efficiently and productively, so that we can hold on to each other and stay together and stay alive. And of course, these are all in the context of like what was happening back then, right? And then from there, yeah, we can go into Aquarius, talking about the context of like, was the system that we created humane? Was it for the people? And then if it's not, then there's this process of trying to, agitate that or reform that in some way. Or just, completely upend it altogether sometimes. In Pisces, then we get into this place of, after everything, after the whole cycle, and reviewing, who we left behind, who we were able to be there for, and everything we were able to do throughout, just reflecting on everything overall, and then just really looking back on what we had done and what we could do, and then thinking forward, at least especially in Aries, about what we'd want to do. And then we go back into the process of doing the same thing all over again. So this all happens in the process of a year. When we think about our sun signs, we think about how the sun is moving within every sign. And within every sign, within every 12 signs, of course, it's within a given season. And this process is always happening every year. Is there any questions about that so far?
Yeah, I actually have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so something that's always been very confusing to me personally about what you just talked about is, so you said that the whole system is in regards to how things were back then, right?
Yes.
I'm assuming in that particular area of where this was presented, because, or how does that work? Because I know, like, for example, like Southern Hemisphere, Northern Hemisphere, like the seasons are actually like switched up.
Yes,
so
they
I
are.
always got confused about that. Like, how does that work, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, no, and thank you for asking that question, because, I mean, the bottom line is this is, and I should kind of articulate that, what this system is Western astrology, and it's Northern Hemisphere centric. That's not to say that that hasn't been applicable in the Southern Hemisphere, only that the way it's been applied has been distinctly different, because, well, not distinctly different, but it is different in a specific way, since, summer and spring are happening where, Libra and Capricorn are beginning, right? So the conditions do change the narrative a little bit, but overall, and I can't really go too much into specifics because other astrologers have really gone into this a lot more than I have. But I think the general idea is that the relationship between the South and the North is that in the South, there is a focus on even an abundance coming together, while when there's less to go around, there's less capacity, and then it's just really fending for oneself, I guess, would be the flip side of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. And yeah, please, if you have any other questions about that after the fact, please let me know. I'm definitely more than willing to try to source you as best as I can. All right, so yes, I went into that. So since we did talk about like the seasons themselves and how it divides the entire zodiac, now we have to get into the parts of the season that kind of move the seasons forward. So I talked about a lot like about the initiators, right? And they're important because they're the ones that kind of bring in the season. So those are called cardinals. The cardinals are Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. And as I kind of talked about, like, since they're initiating the season, every single one of them is very much action oriented in one way or another. In the context of Aries, like I said, this is the beginning of kind of new life and the beginning of like finding your identity and trying to figure out who you are and doing things because that's who you are and trying to like act on who you are. And so that's why like an Aries person tends to be very agitated all the time because, you know, they're always itching to do something and they don't always know what to do, but they always know they want to do something. And it's very impulsive and they're just trying to figure it out the entire time, but they're doing things. And I mean, that really plays into the beginning of spring because like I said, it's like we're now starting anew. We're now trying to figure out what we're going to do now that we have the time to, or now that we have the conditions to do that, right? In Cancer, it's like I mentioned this before, since we're initiating, since we've already gone through the process of having figured out, at least to some degree, what we're doing during these clear conditions, now we have the time to really express ourselves more deeply. In the context of Cancer, it's through familial connections, it's through emotions in general, right? It's through wanting to really initiate these connections with other people or other things, or just in general, just being able to feel ourselves and connect to things and, you know, establish that, so to speak. It's not really a formal connection in terms of intimacy. It's a connection in terms of being familiar with certain things around you, like being able to associate what's around you with what you find to be home or what you find to be familiar. And of course, for this reason, like you want to nurture the things around you that you have connections to, and you are nurtured by the things around you as well, with the connections that you have. Otherwise, you wouldn't have those connections in the first place. So that's another really big part of Cancer in that respect. In Libra, it's more oriented toward the initiation of relationships in one way or another. It can be business, partnership based, or it can be romantic. Can definitely be marriages, signing of any kind of contract. Generally, in terms of Libra, it's always the context of initiating a kind of engagement with another person in one way or another. It's not always peaceful, by the way. If I remember, think actually Genghis Khan was actually a Libra, but I'm not entirely sure on that. Actually, I've just been told that by prior teachers. That said, Libra in general is always focused on trying to develop some kind of way to develop a relationship or develop some kind of way to establish those things with other people. Is there anything else I wanted to say in that respect? If it comes back to me, I will, but I think there was one thing. That said, back to Capricorn in winter, which is, like I mentioned, the initiation of new structures, the initiation of kind of developing certain kinds of discipline, the initiation of, what would be other things that would best encapsulate this? Trying to attempt to be pragmatic in terms of how you're engaging with things around you, and actively just working with your with not necessarily with your hands, but with the material objects around you to manipulate them and control them in a certain way that kind of best suits your interests. Okay, I actually remember what the Libra part was. For Libra, it's also in terms of like being able to compose yourself in specific ways into which to best entice or attract other people so that you can establish those relationships. That was what it was. Okay, any questions on the cardinal part, by the way? Perfect. In the fixed, and also feel free to let me know if like, you know, I'm like just throwing way too much information at you. I end up doing that sometimes. Just feel free to let me know if I need to tone it down or, you know, change my teaching style a little bit just to kind of articulate things better and more accessibly to you all. More than willing to do that. That said, in the fixed, Taurus is, I mean, since it is, and actually I should just get into what fixed is. In the fixed, we're talking about the sustaining of the seasons, whereas the cardinal was beginning the season. The fixed is all about maintaining the season as we're in the thick of the season. So it's like a lot in the context of how I mentioned from spring to summer where, you know, now it's sustained, right? But these are the sustainers here that are actually like honing in on what the season is about. So from Aries, right, we were talking about initiating the spring, initiating life, so to speak, right, and trying to find our identities. Now in Taurus, they've become more concrete in the context of like really focusing on what I want and what I value, right? In general, I know Tauruses are usually associated with often eating is kind of one of the general things that they're like always like known or associated with. And what I think is funny about that is because like, yeah, it deals with the senses, it deals with everything, it deals with touch, it deals with all the things that you can like learn to take in and enjoy. And this very much plays into the seasonal narrative in the context of after you've yielded your first time, or after you've done the work the first time and kind of yielded, and you just have the opportunity as you know, we're getting into the spring now to like, you know, just take some things in really and enjoy the things around you in a sensual way, because this is the first time you've been doing it in a bit, right? So yeah, that's where you really start to learn to, after you've like, we're doing things in Aries, you start to really calm down and just take things in and figure out what it is that you want and what it is you don't want. Really big part of Taurus in terms of, you know, not only just possessions and materials, but also just the values that you want to hold on to. In Leo, it's very similar in that very like in that very fixed way, but the difference is where we came off, where Taurus came off of Aries, right? Here Leo is coming off of Cancer. So it was in the context of, you know, in Cancer, establishing a home, establishing familiarity. In Leo now, we're now talking about after we've really established those connections, we're able to express ourselves in a very, like in a way, like having the home you build or the home you make or the things around you, you establish those kinds of emotional connections with, allow you to kind of create that stage you want that Leo's very much like known for in general. So you're then able to like perform who you are. You're then able to like express what it is that makes you like, that makes you want to really perform in the way that best like fulfills and validates you. Very big part of what Leo deals with in general. So yeah, like I mentioned, like from spring to summer, right? And in the context of sustained conditions, like these are all dealing with persona in this summer. And so like for Cancer, while it was establishing the connections, Leo's dealing with like, now you can express yourself. Now that you have those connections, now you have things that you have like that you're able to establish meaning with emotionally. Those things end up helping you express who you are as the sun kind of passes through it. And Scorpio in the fall of Libra. And as Scorpio, as the sustained part of the fall, is dealing with these kinds of power relations underneath the the relationships that are built in Libra. And a lot of this has to do with, once again, in the fall, we're coming from a place of scarcity. And what ends up happening is when we start having to establish relationships, we end up having to lean a lot on other people. And oftentimes that puts us in very vulnerable and compromising positions. So that's why these questions of trust and these questions of power and these questions of like, how do I control my situation right now when I have absolutely no control over it because I rely on this other person, on this other relationship to kind of like keep me alive or keep me here, right? So yeah, these are big questions that end up happening in Scorpio. In Aquarius, it's like I mentioned before, very much after coming off of Capricorn, like developing these systems, having to, because of like the hyper scarce conditions back then, having to establish systems to kind of facilitate a proper discipline so that we can take care of each other and do what we need to do. Aquarius is asking the questions of, are the practices that we're keeping up with, or are the rules that we're creating here, are they sustainable? Are they humane? Are they for the people? So these are all questions that the Aquarius is asking in the thick of winter, because now we're at the worst part of it. And if it's not helping people, then, you know, there's a lot of questions on what we should be doing with that system, whether it should be upended or whether it should be reformed or things of that nature. So yeah, these are very much like, once we're in the thick of these seasons, we really get down into like what we should be doing during the season, because the conditions are very, very much there and we're stuck with them. That's why these are fixed, and that's why fixed are really known to be stubborn, because they're the ones who are actively trying to tackle these questions, and there doesn't really seem to be any real end to them, at least until it ends, right? Any questions about the fixed at all? All right, perfect. So we will move into the mutable. Whew. So the mutables in general are, to put it very simply, the enders of every single season. And the way they operate in general is just that the enders only like kind of reflecting on what was happening throughout the season, especially after the fixed signs and the questions they were dealing with, but it's also preparing for the beginning of the next season. So these mutables are really these kind of transitionary periods. And this is important to think about, because then it kind of really helps us understand what these signs are specifically doing, when a lot of them oftentimes seem a little all over the place. What they're really trying to do is they're really trying to like focus on preparing, how do we get from the spring to the summer? How do we get from the summer to the fall? Like, how do we prepare the dynamics that we were in the spring to get us into the summer, or into any season from the prior, right? So in the context of Gemini, what we're focusing on is like, in terms of the information we're really focused on, Gemini is always like dealing with, always working with your hands in terms of the skills that you develop, always learning to communicate, always actively trying to like, always trying to think of ways to navigate a certain situation, right? And so a lot of this comes off from like, we came off of Aries, right? Where we were dealing with like, what are we going to do? With Taurus focusing on like, what do we want? What are our values? How do we make this more concrete in terms of who we are? And Gemini, it's the context of how do we manage that, right? How do we kind of navigate how to do things and utilize how to do things to get what we want? So these are all questions we're now thinking about in the context of Gemini as we complete the season, preparing us to get into the next. Because this all plays into then how we start to express ourselves in this more persona way, rather than just kind of base form reptilian identity. In Virgo, it's in the context of, after having reflected on both the spring and the summer at that, on like the things that we did overall, the person that we became. How do we best improve on ourselves, or how do we best be critical about the ways we were doing things so that we can improve on ourselves to prepare for the fall, to prepare oftentimes for relationships with other people. So you start to notice that these signs are always anticipating the next sign, oftentimes as well. So in the context of like we know Virgo, who that tends to be very much focused on details, very much focused on these behaviors or these routines that we do. And so then from there, it's really then a focus on how do we prepare for, engaging with other people in the fall, and what do we need to do to kind of facilitate that better. In Sagittarius, we're talking about in the fall having started like these conditions of scarcity and coming off of, the initiation of those relationships, right, in Libra, and then like the power dynamics that underpin those relationships in Scorpio. In Sagittarius, we're then focused on what did we learn from those relationships? What lessons were we able to get from those, given those power dynamics? And from there, to prepare for the winter, what do we do to kind of allow for, what kind of rules do we need, or what kind of ways do we need to discipline ourselves in order to kind of like make these relationships that we started in the fall more, what would be the best way to put that? To make them better, so to speak, to make them more efficient, to make them more, I think efficient is really the best word for this, because this is the conversation of going into Capricorn, right? But in Sagittarius, it's really reflecting on these lessons, reflecting on these engagements overall. In Pisces, the focus is then on we've gone through the entire 4 seasons, and we're now at the winter, and a lot has happened, and a lot of people have been left behind. There's been it really is actively like focusing and reflecting on everything. And that's a really big word. And in terms of like when you understand a Pisces in general, or when you try to know a Pisces in general, it's not like the things they say or do are very straightforward at all. And it's because there is this general focus on being hyper-reflective, on really trying to take in everything. And I'll definitely get more into that as we talk about the elements. But I mean, when we're thinking about how every single one of these, we're dealing on the reflection of the prior seasons, Pisces is reflecting on all the seasons and reflecting on everything we did and trying to encompass kind of the big picture of everything that happened, so then we can prepare for the spring again in Aries, so we can start a new cycle and start with what we want to do moving forward after having reflected on everything that happened. So now that we kind of went through all the triplicities, is there any questions on any of that?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I was wondering, so I've been told kind of that cardinal, fixed, and mutable, it's kind of this process sometimes where as you go through it, the signs help each other, like get things started, keep it going, and then finish it.
Very much.
I was just wondering, do you have like a particular combo of that you see works more a lot, or like maybe is your favorite? I'm just wondering, because you're very experienced, like what patterns you've seen that you're like, oh, I noticed that this works well because of this in relation to the triplicities.
So when you're saying that, you're talking about like what signs relate to each other the best?
Yeah, I mean, even if it's just like your personal like experience or what you think based off of this, I'm curious. It might be a hard question because it's kind of a big one, but
that is a good question. I think what I would best say is that I mean, there's different dynamics, and it's based on like what you're trying to do, right? Uh, a Capricorn and an Aries, they probably won't get along all too well interpersonally, but when they're trying to work together, at some point, yeah, they're gonna butt heads, but at some point, they really learn to get shit done. Mind my shit. Though but like I said, yeah, they're not really the best in terms of relationships. Oftentimes, oppositions are actually technically good in terms of relationships because they complete each other in a certain sense. But yeah, there's a lot of tension there, and there's often this requirement of like having to balance both sides and both needs. And so maybe the dynamics there are harder, but like it's the same with the square between the Capricorn and the Aries. Once you actually like are able to overcome those things, then it's really solid. But I think the easiest one would generally be the trines, which is from, like, for example, Aries to Sagittarius or Virgo to Capricorn. So I think when we talk about like these kinds of what best relationship dynamics work, I think we're talking about it from not necessarily from what specific sign to what other specific sign, but in the context of the pattern itself, as you mentioned exactly. And you caught on that really quickly because it's like, if they're in this process, then which ones kind of best yield to the other based on what part of the phase it's relating to compared to the other. So that's exactly how we really start getting into the idea of aspects, is what that really is. I won't really go over aspects today. I think I want to go over aspects maybe 2-3 weeks from now if this is something you all are interested in learning more about. But yes, that definitely the triplicities and all the other patterns as well play precisely into what you're talking about. Any other questions while we're at it? I think I see something in the chat. Awesome, thank you. You're very welcome.
I have a question, Ilma.
Yeah.
You mentioned lessons, like learning lessons from Scorpio and Libra season going into Sag, something like that. Can you explain that a little bit more? I think I was trying to figure out what those lessons.
Oh, I'm sorry. So we were talking about how, because in the fall, the Cardinals, the Libra, and that was dealing with kind of establishing those relationships, right? In the Scorpio, we were talking about the kind of dynamics that underpin those relationships oftentimes. In Sagittarius, then, as it's ending the fall, and kind of that entire season dealing with these kinds of one-on-one interpersonal relationships, Sagittarius is trying to really get a good sense of what we learn from that. What do we take away from those relationships? Because now we're different people after having had those relationships, after, really seeing the worst in other people from the power dynamics that we saw in Scorpio and from the trust issues that we noticed and confronted both within ourselves and other people in Scorpio. And so, like, in Sagittarius, the question is really, what is the takeaway?
Okay, totally. Okay, that makes, totally makes sense.
Okay. And of course, if there's anything else you need me to clarify about that, let me know. All right. Are we, before I move on to elements?
I had a question before you continued.
Yeah.
So you were saying like Sagittarius is essentially trying to like figure out a way to integrate all those lessons that were learned from like Libra and Scorpio. So I think like the big like thing that kind of like made me think was like the trust issues from Scorpio. So is that like a thing Sagittarius is trying to figure out, like how to trust again?
No, because I think when we think, and I think this is like a big part of, thank you for asking that. I think what ends up happening when we're talking about the process of the sun is like we're already past those things, right? In Sagittarius, it's like now that the Scorpio part has ended, that part is done and there's a lot of relief. And so then in Sag, it's like, I'm done with those things in some way or another. Maybe you're still with the person or whatever, but there's a takeaway, right? And then the takeaway, you know, there's this kind of, what would be the best way to put it? You're now in a very different place from where you were when you were dealing with those trust issues or with those power dynamics. And so that's why Sagittarius in this context, it's like, what am there's these lessons or there's these morals that we're trying to take away from that. But as I'm doing so, as I'm trying to really learn these things, or as I'm trying to figure these things out or experience these new things, I'm trying to open myself up more to the possibilities. And this is why Sag people in general are like very, what's the best word? Often open and very like, you know, free flowing in many respects.
Okay.
So, I mean, I guess in a sense, yes, but like in terms of what they're generally doing, no.
Cool. I'm a Sagittarius, so like I had to ask, you know.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Any others? I think we're good then. Okay. Moving into the elements. Oh, that's a big one. I like that. That was pretty. Okay. Moving forward. Fire. Oh, what? Fire. I guess I moved those the wrong way. Whoops. Anyways, fire, and like the elements in general are all dealing with specific parts of kind of the general flow. And you notice how like the pattern is generally always fire, earth, air, and water. That doesn't change. And that pattern itself also kind of flows into alongside the seasons as well as another overlay. So we're going to kind of like talk a bit about what each one means and how the sign really expresses that. In Aries, as the cardinal fire, right? Like, and we have to think about how fire is really most best associated with identity, and also to a certain extent action. Because in the context of Aries, which best really kind of illustrates, you are based on what you do, or you do because that is who you are, is very much a big, like this is really a fire thing. Like this is the initiation of that fire. Like we're trying to figure that out. Like who are we in that respect in terms of Aries? In terms of what we do, not necessarily in any more deeper, profound way, at least for Aries, oftentimes. So Aries as the cardinal fire, right? That's the one that makes it action-oriented. Because it's cardinal fire, it's initiating action. It's initiating identity. It's initiating life. So that's kind of a big part of like pushing along that fire in that sense. So it's really kind of directional in terms of who it's trying to be and all of those things. In Leo, identity is here as well, and it's in the fixed context. So whereas in the cardinal is directional, or it was trying to do something all the time, in Leo as a fixed sign, so that means it's not moving at all. What it's trying to do is it's trying to express itself. It's trying to perform itself because it's doing it from a place of stillness. So how does it best perform itself? How does it best draw other people in to a certain extent? Where is its stage? And this is the stage where it concretely grounds itself in. I shouldn't probably use ground itself because that is a little confusing. That it kind of settles into, more or less, to kind of perform themselves in the way that is most fulfilling to their identity. So in this context, Leo's as a fire is trying to basically like most closely attach itself to what its identity really is. So that would be the distinction between where Aries is trying to do and like find its identity through doing, and Leo like finding its identity through expressing from a single place or from a single stage. That is its own. And Sagittarius as a mutable. So like I said, mutable is this kind of free-flowing area. And so when we're talking about in the context of fire, like fire is dealing with identity, but mutable is a little more fluid. So what this ends up meaning in terms of like what is happening in Sagittarius is that the very free-flowing mutable makes identity more bigger in the question of like, who are you, rather than the other two, where they were mostly based on like, how do you express yourself, or how do you do yourself, right? This is a little more profound, often a little more philosophical, but also it's often in the context of these bigger concepts that define us. And that can be in the context of causes, that can be in the context of religions, that can be in the context of cultures or ethnic groups or nations. All of these kinds of bigger concepts that bring people together, that they share this identity with, that make them act on behalf of those identities, tend to be these very Sagittarian, like mutable fire kinds of identities, often kind of giving themselves up to like, these more philosophical or like experiential kind of identities, so to speak. Is there any questions on that, on the fire so far in general? No? Okay.
I actually kind of had like a comment.
Oh, okay.
I feel like all of my things that I've seen in astrology, like Sagittarius is the one that I feel like has like the most kind of like other placements. Like I can't tell you how many like people on Twitter that are Sagittariuses have Venuses in Scorpio as well. Like I feel like there's a big influence between like Scorpio and Sagittarius, and I feel like a lot of times like Sagittarius gets lost in between like Scorpio and Capricorn. Like I feel like there's a whole brand of like Cap Sages and like Scorpio Sages.
Yeah, actually, a big part of that has to do with the fact that so as the sun's moving through all of these signs, especially Mercury and Venus particularly, they're the ones that, because the Earth is, there'll be planets that are kind of outside, so the Earth is orbiting around the sun, and there are planets that are orbiting within that orbit. So Mercury and Venus specifically have their like orbital patterns kind of within the Earth's orbital pattern. And then there's planets that are outside of that orbital pattern. And so oftentimes what ends up happening is as we like kind of look at it in the terms of astrology, Venus and Mercury specifically don't stray too far from the sun. But if they do, they either stray farther one way or the other way. But they don't really go past one sign. They'll go into the next sign or the prior sign, but they won't go beyond that. So that's why sometimes we end up in a place where like the Mercury and the Venus can be in Capricorn while you're in Sag, or the Mercury and Venus can be in Taurus while you're in Aries. So that's kind of how that process plays out. And like when you think about like other planets that might pop by on top of that, it really starts to look like this pattern.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Of course. So any other questions? Okay. Moving forward. Oh, right. Forward might be Earth. So Earth deals with everything that is material. And so that means that like the things that we have to physically engage with in life. And often that kind of comes with like a lot of dynamics in terms of how we manipulate Earth, how we relate to Earth, how we relate to kind of the material things around us. In the context of Taurus, this has everything more to do with like grounding ourselves in the things that we like and the things that and avoiding the things we don't like, right? As we make that choice. Also like really possessing things, like really taking things in, so to speak. And also just enjoying the things that are around you very much is a Taurus-based thing. And if you think about that in the context of all the senses, those are all very Taurian-based concepts. And that is as a fixed Earth, right? So as a fixed Earth, it's really focusing on specifically like the material things themselves and like enjoying them, taking them in, absorbing them, like. And this is why like Taurus people are probably the most stubborn, because they're really about the things that they like and really about the things that they enjoy and don't want to let go of those. So in Virgo, it is a mutable Earth. So whereas the Taurus was really focusing on, in the context of like Earth, like just being fixed in what it enjoys and what it wants and what it doesn't want, the Virgo is immutable. And mutable, like I said, is kind of this more free-flowing thing because it's the end of every sign. It ends up putting Virgo in a position where its relationship to Earth is always like very, very specifically detailed. Because if it's trying to encompass everything that is Earth, it has to start with the minute things. And so this is why Virgo specifically are always like dealing with detail-oriented tasks, particularly like oftentimes sanitary work, oftentimes like service work, oftentimes really focusing on the best practices, routines, and details to kind of improve on oneself. Is there any questions about that one specifically? Because I know that one's a little weirder to understand. No? Okay. So into Capricorn as the cardinal Earth, right? And as I really kind of got into it a little bit as we were going into the winter, but like as a cardinal Earth, it is talking about really having to actively move and actively manipulate Earth in the specific ways that it wants to kind of facilitate the proper conditions for discipline, for shaping certain behaviors, for doing the things that they want to accomplish, really is a big part of that. I think that's the best way to put it. Is there any questions on Capricorn in that respect? Or actually any of the Earth signs? Okay. So is there anyone against me moving into air right now? Okay. Air. So air is generally associated with information and communication. And so the best way to kind of understand this in the context of like the air signs is, well, let me just kind of start with Gemini, right? Like Gemini is very much the sign of communication itself. It's very much the sign of like learning to very much like starting to talk, just generally talk and communicate with, people in very, all the time in different ways. Navigating different things in different situations, often in these like, I have a question. Thank you, Allison. Why isn't Aries an air sign? Aries is not an air sign.
I'm just fucking with you. Go on. Go on. Keep going.
I know. I really love Okay. Okay. I'll go back into it.
Okay, sorry. You're doing great. I love you.
I actually enjoyed it. I did. It reminded me that there are people here, and that made me very happy.
Also, Ilma, you have
So
a
somebody
question.
wanted me to explain the grounding of Capricorn. So in general, all the earth signs are kind of grounding in all the earth signs in general are grounding in their own ways because they're always like connecting to the earth in some way, right? They're always trying to like relate to the earth in some way. In Capricorn, the really grounding part is being very intentional about its physical space and being very intentional about the ways in which the conditions that they're in shape them. And so being able to manipulate Earth in a specific way to condition behavior in ways that help facilitate better, to kind of facilitate better discipline in the ways that they want to, develop structures to like facilitate that better is very much what helps them do the things that they need to do. Does that make sense? Is there any like questions about that? Okay, checking the chat again. Thank you. All right. I'm assuming I answered that. Moving on. So as I mentioned, air is generally speaking kind of this analogy for information and communication. And so in the context of Gemini, like as a mutable air, very quintessential kind of air sign because it's dealing with the very free flow of air. It's actively dealing with like generally conversing very freely with anyone about anything, really. Often in a superficial basis, but it's only to really just kind of get conversation out there is kind of the biggest part about it. So, and this is often why, like, if you really start to see like how communication happens and how, especially in the context of air, like, it's not only just like communicating and just kind of actively communicating to avoid, but that you're always kind of in some way relating to the other person or in some way always kind of associating with the other person as you're communicating with them. And so in doing that, what we end up doing is we end up really trying to relate to the person in some way as we're communicating to them. That's why we want to do that in the first place. And this is why, at least for Gemini, the one that's really focused on communicating with everyone about everything all the time, Geminis tend to come off as, this is why Geminis tend to come off as a little two-faced, because they're just more all over the place, really, than anything else. But yeah, that said, Gemini, I think one important thing to understand about just air in general, when we think about what information is and kind of how it's kind of transferred and such, the best way to kind of understand that is based on associations themselves, not between two people necessarily, but specifically between trying to relate two different things to each other. And that, for example, like in terms of language, the kind of words that are coming out of my mouth don't really have any meaning. The sounds that I'm making don't really have any meaning. It's really babble until we attribute meaning to it. So it's always associating one thing with another. And this is really important in the context of these air signs because they're always trying to like utilize this or manage this in some way. With Gemini, it's the active practice of doing it and like actively just doing it with everyone, because it's really just trying to collect it and oftentimes disperse it. In Libra, as a cardinal air, as opposed to the mutable air that was free-flowing with that information, Libra is focused on being a little more intentional about the kind of ways in which it relates, in which it communicates, and the information that it uses to properly attract people and to properly establish certain kinds of relationships. So it's really more thoughtful in the ways in which it composes itself, all the various kind of body motions and body language and all the cues that it needs to properly like assimilate or kind of properly accommodate a person in the proper way to kind of get them to do precisely what they'd like to see happen. In the context of Aquarius as a fixed air, so then now it's in the context of really just like air being in a very like insular space oftentimes, because it's kind of really compounding on all the information that happens, and often this is associated with knowledge or friendship or groups, because it's really kind of like consolidating on all this information that kind of relates people to each other, relates things to each other, to kind of develop systems of information and knowledge, or communities, or society as a whole, really. And this ends up really being funny because then we kind of come to this contradiction with Aquarius, the question of whether, like, why are they so chaotic if they're very much dealing with these processes that really harmonize, more or less, like really try and consolidate people and information together. And a big reason for this is because it doesn't actively control what everybody's doing as they're relating to each other in a community or in a society. What it's doing is people are doing things and you're doing things in tandem with them, and then things end up happening. A lot of times, like in society in general, we end up taking in certain things, or we end up impressing on certain things. And like the associations that I mentioned, we start developing very much like different kinds of associations as society's kind of growing. And we start to internalize certain associations that nobody would have ever before. And when we really think about sun signs and why Aquarians are considered like these weird, like kind of out of left field kind of people, what ends up happening is that Aquarians more often than not tend to externalize a lot of these weird associations that kind of people would not have really understood given their lives and given what they've internalized in society. But what ends up happening is the Aquarians are really internalizing everything they've taken in from society, from that point. And so that's why from before that point, it made absolutely no sense. But when it came in and when it really presented itself, very like, almost like out of nowhere, we can really look back as to what kind of logically led someone to that conclusion. So yeah, that's why in that way, like Aquarius is always dealing with to some degree, always with this kind of like ongoing association or ongoing contradiction between chaos and kind of cohesion and harmony. Is there any questions about air signs in general?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So you just said kind of a mix of chaos and I think you said, well, something else about Aquarius.
Oh, cohesion, or I guess harmony, either one works.
So I've thought this, I've kind of asked you this before, and I think someone else briefly tapped on it, but what do you know or think about the fact that Aquarius is an air sign, but it's the water bearer?
Right. Well, I mean, the water bearer is bearing water, which means that, you know, the water bearer isn't necessarily air. I'm sorry, the water bearer isn't necessarily water. So there's that. The other thing is just more so that what the Aquarius is doing, at least in the context of what the water bearer was symbolizing, was that it was really, and this is actually an Egyptian symbol, and it's dealing with kind of the pouring of the water into the Nile, and really trying to, it really kind of, bearing the water is, that water itself and pouring the water down the Nile is associated or kind of an allegory to kind of a flourishing society, like bringing information, bringing knowledge, bringing all the things that kind of bring people together, and really kind of cultivating the flourishing of society, so to speak. It's not necessarily water in the astrological context, but the water is generally associated with like these more airy things. Cooperation being kind of the main one, I would say. And society.
Thank you. That was super helpful. Thank you.
Okay. I think someone is going. So, okay, so that was from Mariana, said thank you. And I gotta end my mom's dialysis treatment, so they left. Thank you, Mariana, for coming here. And also, yeah, if anyone else has to leave and you wish to make it known, feel free. That said, are we ready to move on into water? Okay. Oh, we're back at fire. Okay, we're at water. So, starting off with Cancer, and I guess we should get into what water means. Water is generally associated with emotions, is generally associated with psychology, generally associated with this kind of like intrinsic connection between people in this kind of generally ethereal way. And so that kind of process, generally speaking, is for the water signs, how they're kind of using that or manipulating that or trying to like move with that in some way. In the Cancer context, as a cardinal water is actively focused on initiating those kinds of forms of familiarity or trying to initiate those kinds of emotional connections with the things around them and often with the people around them. This is what like ends up happening in terms of why they are so nurturing, because they're really trying to engage in those ways. They're really trying to establish that kind of familiarity and like express that familiarity with them. Those real, and so when I say that, it's always kind of directional in that way. Like it's not necessarily that there's always this expectation from the other, only that they're just trying to like give it, or that they're trying to connect to it, or that they're trying to like nurture it in some way. And often in itself, like nurturing a connection is often asking for that kind of connection with other people in some way. Is there any questions on that one? Okay. In Scorpio, as a fixed water sign. So this is the focus specifically on, like we were already like trying to develop those connections in Cancer. Now it's the focus on, as a fixed water sign, bonds, on these really like on intimacy. Now that the lines have kind of been casted, now they kind of solidify into these deeper connections. And often like within these deeper connections, you know, a lot more is exposed, a lot more issues around trust are like hyper focused on, a lot of these issues around the power dynamics within an emotional relationship and how they can compromise people oftentimes are really like emphasized here. And so like, yeah, the Scorpio in this context is, rather than where the Cancer was trying to like establish those, the Scorpio is really thinking hard about like whether these kinds of entanglements are the kinds that they want to be in, if the person they are engaging with or the thing that they're engaging with is really trustworthy in that respect, and whether they should really invest their time in it or not. And so then in Pisces, as the mutable water, is then focused specifically as a mutable water. It's this really free-flowing like connection in that respect. And since it's a lot more dispersed when we're talking about like the feelings, when we're talking about the connections, when we're talking about what's more ethereal, we then really start focusing on, more than anything, impressions. And like I mentioned, like Pisces is kind of the end sign, really reflecting on all of the seasons of the year. And so the best way to encapsulate that, especially after having gone through the process of this pattern of like, there's always a process of starting with a fire and then moving on into an earth and moving on into an air. So when we were trying to find who we were and do things to figure that out, and then when we were trying to like concretely consolidate them into like how we want that to relate to the things around us that were material, and then how we want to engage with other people and kind of cooperate with other people to kind of facilitate that. And through like the process of like, you know, doing and like figuring that out materially, and then also kind of like thinking and figuring those things out mentally, we're now in a process of, at the end of those in water, it's always this focus on, I've gone through all of those things, and now I'm just so intrinsically connected to them that they're just such a part of me, like in this more ethereal way. I feel those things. So in Pisces, kind of being the end sign of both the process of the elements and also the process of the seasons, encapsulating literally everything. What the Pisces is doing, it can't really do that with everything, right? So what the Pisces is actually doing is it's taking in impressions. And what that means is like, what is the general feeling when you walk into the room? What is the general feeling of this kind of film? What is the general feeling of like this overall narrative? Or what is the general feeling that I'm getting from just this person? So it's really these more like very vague indicators of what is happening in a very emotional way. But it's very free flowing. It's very mutable, right? But as you're doing this, like, you really encapsulate it. You really like are taking everything in a certain way, but it's always in this very emotional and very ethereal way. Does that make sense in terms of the Pisces? And is there any questions about any of these water signs while we're at that?
I have a question that's not necessarily water sign related, but I know you talked about this before, that the last 4 signs, I think it's Sag, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, are like related to the social, and I was just wondering if you could explain that again.
Yeah.
I mean, part of this. Maybe that's a different part of this.
Oh, I mean, it is. And I guess I didn't necessarily specifically outline that, right? But I think like we can really start off the social in the context of, I mean, okay, actually I should make a distinction then. So there's 2 different kinds of like models we use for that. And one of them is kind of the specific division between a spring, summer, and fall, winter. And me really outlining that distinction between like clear conditions, like developing one's kind of overall identity and persona, and then the distinction between scarcity and relying on other people and developing like kind of more social skills and developing like those dynamics in a social context from Libra to Pisces in the fall, winter. And then there's the other kind of model that's dealing with dividing this process of fire, earth, air, and water, and because it happens 3 times, right? It's the Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, then it's the Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, and then there's the Sag, as you said, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. And so these processes essentially, as I mentioned just now, actually, and thank you for really pointing it out, because I probably wouldn't have touched on that if you hadn't, is really kind of another overlay on this system. And keep in mind, like this system, it wasn't necessarily like, you know, devised by one culture. It was like literally a consolidation of multiple cultures. So that's why this thing ends up being so like interconnected and interwoven within many concepts, because this system is actually like very much derived from all of those different systems. But essentially what's happening is basically within the process of the first fire to water phase. We're really focusing in on like developing who you are, and then from there the connections with other things because of who you are, from Aries to Cancer, and in all the various ways in identity, earth, mental in air, and then water in Cancer, and then doing that in a more in the context of like our personas, and then how we develop who we have to be in our personas to really connect to other people, as we really start to embark on that with Leo, Virgo, Libra, and then Scorpio, because then we go from there, like from how do we express ourselves all the way to how do we trust people expressing ourselves in this way, or knowing that they are these kinds of people. And then from Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, coming from a place of like having learned what we learned from how to engage with other people, or how to like who we are, how do we what kind of things should we establish amongst each other. And like I said, like Sag as the mutable fire is kind of like, it's, even though it is still specifically like, it's not entirely in the very hypersocial winter place, it is still like, it's still this in between, and it's still focusing on kind of connecting to identities on this more broader, in these broader umbrella areas, in the context of ethnic identity, in the context of religion, in the context of like kind of these kind of causes, or these bigger identities, so to speak. So then from there, it's then the question of like having gone through and having to connect with people in these various ways, and notice how as we go through this process, we're connecting to even more and more different things. Sagittarius really starting off this like fire to water hypersocial last phase, like is then dealing with from Sagittarius to Pisces then, right? What do we do with how do we engage with each other in general in society? How should society even be for us? What kinds of society should we develop to facilitate like what we believe is best overall? And so like we're talking about Sagittarius in terms of, you know, those more philosophical questions, then Capricorn in terms of those material systems, Aquarius in the context of how people are relating to each other, right? And so asking the question of whether it's more humane for that very reason. And then in Pisces, really, like I mentioned, overall, like taking it all in these very more ethereal kind of often narrative-based conceptions. I'm sorry, that was a lot to throw at you. Did that kind of help?
No, I love that. Yeah,
Okay, perfect.
very helpful, because I remember when we first started talking about the sociality of the last 4 signs, I was really confused because I actually see different types of social, like I feel like Cancers are like the most social of the water signs. Maybe it's just because I'm a Cancer myself. But I get what you mean sociality. You're talking more about like when we talked about Capricorn is like the social expectations, and you're talking more about like the way that you're shifting from the material sociality to like the concept, like conceptual sociality.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think what's important to note here, right? It's like when I'm talking about these themes shaped by seasons, we're not talking about necessarily precisely the behaviors that cultivate them, though that is mentioned. What we're talking about is the general thematic, like overall idea that they're always having to confront, especially in the context of a sun sign, because that's what you know, that's how you express, and that's the character you deal with under those pressures. And so like as a there's many different kinds of Cancers, right? They can be very social, and they can also be withheld, because they also, as they're trying to connect to things, oftentimes they're often also not when they're trying to establish familiarity with things, they're not always familiar with them already, so they're not always going to be actively nurturing to everything. that it's in contact with until, you know, it really knows it can be. And with some cancers, they really know that they can be with everything because they found this place of belonging to the point where they can do that. They can be that with everyone. They can show that love openly. And so in that context, we can recognize that every sign, every sun sign, right? Because I mean, it doesn't really even encapsulate the entirety of how people are really operating, but they're all engaging with society, but the ways in which they do. For the lower half, it's always in the context of like, often individually, often in the context of like how they need to operate personally, while the upper half is more in the context of like how should people between each other operate. So these are more like thematic questions that they're engaging with, that then from the pressures of how they have to deal with them and who they are, dictate their behavior. Does that help?
Yes.
Perfect. And honestly, this is pretty much what I wanted to talk about this from this point. I mean, I definitely would love to have gone into more, but if we did, we would have gone forever. I think if you're all interested, we can end up doing this on a weekly basis. I'm definitely more than willing to do that, or a bi-weekly basis. It doesn't matter either way. But either way, yeah. What did you all, do you have any questions? What did you all think about it? Anything like that, feel free to just drop it.
So I have a quick question.
Dígame.
Pisces confuses me, I'm not gonna lie. Like I understand Pisces as a little bit of everyone to a degree, and you were talking about the idea of impressions.
Yes.
So I don't want to ask you to repeat yourself. I'm wondering if like you can like maybe
Elaborate on what an impression is in this context.
Sure. I'm trying to understand Pisces a little more. So anything you can give me in that regards, I would appreciate it.
So I think this is the best way. Because it's a mutable water, it's not any specific persons. It's not directional coming from someone. It's not fixed as in coming from like, you know, this very intense feeling or this intense bond. It's very communal. It's coming from everything. We're all emitting and engaging with each other in this very ethereal way, even as we're doing everything else. It's just as a consequence of just being around each other. Us engaging with each other, even though like the connection isn't really there. I guess if we were in a room, this would be a lot more clear because there's this real like clear concrete, like, well, not concrete exactly, it's really vague, but there's this feeling that we get from all of us being in the room, really engaging with each other in a specific way, creating a certain air around what that overall feeling is. And so that's kind of like that mutable connection, like that's what we gather from that, right? And oftentimes, even when you're just taking in the impression of a single person, you're not just taking in the impression of a single person. As we were talking about in terms of how to protect yourself in tarot, we're opening ourselves oftentimes, even when we're not engaged in, you know, any spiritual work intentionally, we're oftentimes just actively kind of meandering about and connecting and taking in and receiving a lot of, you know, of these connections from a lot of different people. So it's not just you. I'm in some way like an impression from any one of us is often a connection from everybody around us. And this is kind of very much how like psychics and empaths end up really picking up on things in relating to not only just the person themselves and how they're feeling, but how other people connected to them are feeling. Because that's what those impressions really are. It's this very communal, ethereal connection with everything.
Helps, thank you.
Of course.
You have another question in the chat.
Oh, another question in the chat. Okay. Question, how does being in the cusp between two signs impact behavior? This is a good question. there is a system to this, but I think the best way to put it is if we really think about the process of how we went into the beginning to the middle to the end, we can actually apply this logic within a sign. And the processes that a sign has to go through in terms of, you know, like I mentioned, the themes it has to face and who it ends up becoming confronting those things, going through a process of whether you're in the beginning of a sign, just barely like really confronting these things because that's where the sun was when you were born, or toward the end of the sign where you are in terms of like having really been born after a lot of these things have really been resolved. There's a very different, I mean, not too different, but there's a distinctly different energy between the two, being from the beginning to the end. What I would say though is, while it may prepare for the next, it isn't the next. That would be my distinction. Sagittarius, and I kept saying in terms of the mutables, are preparing for the end, for the beginning of something new. They are not the beginning of something new. A Gemini is not a Cancer. A Gemini is often really thinking about like how to relate to things, and when it gets to the end of Gemini, it's like really actively having, I guess the best word, really not completed its journey, but having really, it's really a lot more seasoned in its understanding and how it relates to everything around it, I guess would be the best way to put it.